So what's that mean to you? Well, there was an article that I picked up a couple years ago about Ireland outlawing voting machines, electronic voting. I don't know if they were doing it online, I think so. We know that students now in the US are being fined heavily for illegal downloads of music. This is a big concern for our CISO because when kids come back to school, which is going to be in about 3 or 4 weeks, the first thing that happens is our networks clog because everybody's out from under mom and dad and they start to download like crazy. But then this stuff brings penalties and fines, and there is a tendency to holding universities responsible, at least in the States, for activities of kids. Outsourcing. I had a major outsourcer in Seattle, I won't name them, but I had an opportunity to present to them about a couple of weeks ago, and one of the gentlemen asked me, gee, you know, I'm starting to get concerned about customer data in the supply chain. I'm thinking, just starting? And then there's the Amaro case. And Stephen mentioned that this morning. This is an egregious case of a temporary teacher who came to school, used a school computer that hadn't been adequately patched, and when she turned it on, it had been infected with malware that popped up porn pictures. Now, she was arrested. These were middle school kids. She was arrested. She was tried. The forensics was poorly done. You know the case. It's famous because the forensics were horribly botched. This was back in the middle of the last decade when people were really ignorant. And so she was looking at a 40-year jail sentence. It took some forensic experts who volunteered their time to untangle the mess, to really explain to the court system, they took it all the way to the Supreme Court of the state of Connecticut, that this was poorly done. But what happened to her can't be undone. She lost her license. It had a huge impact on her health and her family. So what we're seeing is a challenge to the legal system. These are all unintended consequences. And I mentioned critical infrastructure. I had an opportunity to do a study for NIST, and we looked at all of the infrastructure installations in the Northwest. There wasn't one that we found that didn't have a workaround at the operational level that allowed access to, through the internet, through public networks, access to control systems. So you could actually control physical infrastructure through the internet. There wasn't one that didn't do it. And yet if you talk to management, management would assert that they had a policy to keep them separate. But the technical folks have to solve problems. And one poor guy said, look, he said, it snows here. And when it's snowy, I respond to an alert. I don't want to walk all the way to the station. So he did a little workaround. This is the bottom line. This is one of my favorite cartoons. You folks historically have had a history with the Goths and the Vandals and the Huns, I think. Many years ago, I used to study Anglo-Saxon history and literature. It's the geeks now. And as Stephen said, a lot of them have Asperger's. They're not thinking about the social impacts if you work with them. So here's my metaphor, and this is an image I'd like to leave with you because I have a painting in my office that reminds me all the time what I'm about. Mickey Mouse in Fantasia, do you remember? He grabs the magic wand, he decides to automate housekeeping, he gets carried away, and he ends up falling asleep in a big mess, and the emperor comes back and there's some severe, or the wizard comes back, there's some severe consequences. So how do we stay safe online? I'd like to argue that security and privacy, from my perspective, I'm looking at the technical things that we do to networks and systems to implement those ideas. So to me, they're basically two sides of the same coin because we use a lot of the same tools and techniques. Security being, in my mind, something that's outward looking, and privacy, looking at some of the definitions that we saw earlier, it involves some inward looking as well and some personal responsibility. We saw an evolution of security methods from the 1980s, where security is primarily physical. And then we go through a period of time where we have desktop computers that are hooked into mainframes. And then we got into this age where we're starting to look at networks throughout our organizations, and we're using a term called information assurance, meaning that we're looking at the entire environment and thinking of ways to make the entire environment safe for information. And we started with the castle approach. I had an opportunity to drive by a couple of interesting castles and be reminded that it has been a model for designing security. We've had defense in depth, we've had perimeter defense, but I hate to say it, these aren't working anymore. Firewalls, antivirus, IDS, IPS, by themselves they're not working. It doesn't mean you don't use them, but people are getting violated anyway. And I also should remind you that when we do implement controls like firewalls and antivirus, we're making some assumptions, and here we get to the people factor. We're assuming that the design implements everything we want it to. We're assuming that the total of all the controls we implement are going to match all of our goals and achieve them. We're assuming that the implementations are correct. Nobody ever makes a mistake in IT, right? We always load our antivirus properly, and we never forget patches. And we think that the installation administration is correct, right? Well, the bottom line is, the assumption should be that you will never own a perfectly secure system. There will always be trade-offs. That also means you need to be alert and aware and know your environment and know what you're getting into. What can you do? Well, I think part of an individual strategy, because I hate to say this, I hope you got from Kian's presentation that the cavalry is not coming. We don't have solutions. Remember the old cowboy movies, the cavalry comes over the hill? The solutions aren't there yet. We will eventually solve problems, but we don't have the solutions yet. Technology has rapidly outpaced our ability to comprehend and our ability to manage what we've done to ourselves. So, we're on our own. Does this sound familiar? So there are some things that you can do. First of all, I think we owe it to ourselves to be aware of the threat. And that was the purpose of this discussion today. You need to be aware of the threat, mindful of it. You do need to implement layered defense at home. Multiple tools on your system. You need to have a patch program. You need to upgrade your tools. I'm not saying that you don't do that, but they aren't by themselves totally adequate. You need to implement privacy options in your social media. That's been mentioned a number of times. You need to be deliberate about where your data resides. You know, I was talking with someone the other day about who we are. What is our identity? Our identity used to be us, right? And now when you talk to kids, when I talk to my students, their identity stretches way out there. They have hundreds of friends. They have data everywhere. And maybe they don't have a definition of friendship like I might have, but I think many think those are their friends. So our sense of who we are and what our identity is has really expanded. So we need to understand where our data resides. Now, sometimes you don't have control over that. You turn your data over to a company, even if you opt out and you don't want your data shared, there's nothing to say they couldn't make a mistake. Do you folks recall Kobe Bryant's situation, the basketball player in the US? He was accused of rape, and in the state of Colorado, the identity of the victim is held privately. And then somebody in the judge's office thought they'd put all this up online to make it easier for people to access, and they didn't redact the name. And it didn't matter. Every media person in the country had access to her name instantaneously, and there was no intent. You know, the woman wanted to abide by the law, she just wasn't thinking. So we turn our data over to people that may be well-intentioned, but they have the same problems you and I do about keeping things up to date and being mindful of what the rules are. People are people, they make mistakes. I think something that's really helpful and that I emphasize in my classes is having people think like the bad guy. Most of us in this room will look at something positively, We'll build something and we think about all the good things we can do with it, but there are people out there that spend all their time looking at things inside out. And it never ceases to amaze me what folks can come up with. Like the gentleman who tracked his wife online. He installed smart meters in his house. He knew when she put the roast in the oven, because there's electrical signals that come that identify certain appliances on these smart meters. So he knew when the oven was turned on. So he knew when his meal was not going to be on time, because he knew what she was going to cook, because he told her what he wanted for dinner. So he came through that front door loaded for bear every time she was late, and she got a thrashing. I have to tell you, when she took her story to a women's shelter, they thought she'd lost her mind. They couldn't imagine what she's talking. What do you mean he knows when you put the oven? What do you mean he knows what room you're in? Come on. Well, yes, he did. He understood how to use and subvert technology. Another use for that equipment is to be able to drive through a neighborhood, pick up a signal, and tell when people are home and when they're not. Particularly if you've cased the neighborhood and you've learned what their patterns of usage are. So all I'm telling you, what we are doing for convenience and for really positive reasons in the hands of people who think inside out can be subverted. It doesn't hurt to think like a bad guy. And when I teach my classes, I have my students do that. It's really fun. I have them social engineer. I mean, within guidelines. I have them do some dumpster diving. I have them stretch their minds to think like the perpetrator thinks. Because we need to be as agile, as clever, as out of the box in our thinking as they are. This is an arms race, no mistake. And also limit your children's access. That goes without saying, but I should make special point here. I've written an article for Teacher Librarian about resources that are available to help parents think through what to do with children. Kids know technology better than adults. This may be the first generation in history where that's the truth. They're also, unfortunately, more prone to commit cybercrime. They might not even know what's good and bad, because we don't even know enough to tell them what's good and bad in terms of online behavior. Things like plagiarism sites, music downloads. You know, what were they going to miss? A copy of the tune. Disrespect for intellectual property. There's also some other characteristics of children. We've seen cases of cyberbullying. We've also seen the case like the young lady I talked about who went to the West Bank about blind trust online. Kids don't have the filters. So there really is a need for training of kids in the early grades.